All right. Let's get it going. Welcome to Office Hours, special edition. I think I'll wait just a couple minutes before I start going over things, but wait till 1. But basically what my plan is today is I'm going to go over quite a few of the basics and fundamentals that I think, like, through coaching people over the years, I find it can be really helpful to make sure you read the tooltips and like understand what the fundamental parts of the kit are doing. And then I'll go into the 10.1 rotation and a little bit of changes that's happening with that. Actually, be right back real quick. Yeah, just a second. All right, I'm back. While we're waiting another minute or so, are there any initial questions before I get started? All right. Okay, so to start, I'm gonna go over some of the spells. So initially, the foundation of the arcane playstyle is, or really just the arcane spec, is arcane charges. I don't actually know if there's a tip for that, but you can think of arcane charges essentially as like the combo points for arcane. We have a handful of ways that we generate arcane charges, and then we have one way that we spend them with Barrage. How exactly we navigate arcane charges really depends on how hard every part of our kit is hitting, really. And, you know, like we have the ramp this tier, and we've had the ramp for a while. But so arcane charges are generated up to 4, and then you spend them with Barrage. The first arcane charge generator is Arcane Blast, and Arcane Blast is pretty much the primary like rotation filler for single target. But the important thing to be aware of with that is it generates 1 arcane charge, but the damage of Arcane Blast, the cast time, and the mana cost of Arcane Blast is dependent on how many arcane charges you have. This means that 0 arcane charges casts very slow, and it ramps up to where 4 arcane charges is the equivalent of basically a global, same duration. So that damage and mana cost and whatnot scales with arcane charges. And then Arcane Explosion is the AoE arcane charge generator, and the way that works is you have to be within 10 yards of a target, but so long as you hit them, right, you generate an arcane charge. So that's your go-to filler on 3+ targets, but it is something that you can use to generate an arcane charge at range, like on the move, if you know, are in a situation that's a good thing. Also, side note, this is a little bit of a min-max, but generating your first arcane charge in single target with arcane explosion is technically more damage than a 0 charge arcane blast, but not many situations where we do that. Okay, and then arcane orb. So arcane orb it's a talent, but we take it all the time. And the way that arcane orb works is it generates 1 arcane charge when cast. It travels very similarly to frozen orb, except that it won't stop when it hits a target. And that's really important to be aware of, because if you cast it, say here, let's see, I'm gonna get it back. If I were to cast it here and that training dummy was not in combat with my group, it would be now, right? So it's good to be aware of. But basically, arcane orb, it generates 1 charge when cast, 1 arcane charge when cast, and then 1 arcane charge for each target it hits. And I just like to think of it as, when I use arcane orb on 3 targets or more, that equals 1 arcane barrage, because that gives you your 4 arcane charges to give you a full arcane barrage. And then on single target, it means that arcane orb generates 2 arcane charges, 1 for the cast, 1 for the hit. And then the last arcane charge generator is Touch of the Magi. And this is a DPS cooldown, so I'm going to go into details, more detail in the rotation section about, you know, how that's navigated. But basically what you need to know about it is it's off the global, so it can be cast whenever. It has a fun combo with Barrage and Magi, which again, I'll go into that in the rotation section. But it generates 4 arcane charges, right? So it fills up your charges bar and gives you maximum ability to cast that maximum damage arcane blast or that full 4 charge barrage. And then one of the talents to be aware of that is intrinsically linked to Touch of the Magi is Arcane Echo. And what Arcane Echo does is any direct damage that you deal to your Magi target, so that's AoE or single target, just direct damage, it procs for AoE damage. And this interacts with Nether Tempest. I'll go over that in just a sec. But this has an interesting interaction during Magi. And is a source of a decent amount of damage, especially in AoE. And then, so Arcane Barrage is our spender, in the sense that we generate these arcane charges, and then when we cast Barrage, they get used, and the barrage goes out. If you'll notice, that only hit 1 target. And the reason for that is because I don't have the talent Arcane Cleave right now, but this is a very important part of the Arcane Toolkit to understand, is that the interaction between Resonance, which Arcane Barrage deals 15% more damage per target hit, and Arcane Cleave, which causes Barrage to cleave onto an additional target for each arcane charge, so up to 4 additional targets. What that means is every time you have 5 targets, your Barrage is doing 60% more damage, right? Which is a huge amount of increase. So, and another thing well, yeah, I'll just talk about it right now. Barrage used to be really annoying when it came to cleave and not want to cleave, but it seems like they have gone they changed something. Something changed, and Barrage cleaves really nicely now, which is pretty amazing. But the important thing to be aware of for Barrage AoE damage specifically, and Funnel, because when you have 4 additional targets to cleave onto with Barrage, it's increasing your single target Barrage hit as well. So Funnel is actually a reason why we could want to line up our CDs or hold things, you know, for a very small, short period of time. But the extra potential 60% damage on Barrage can be pretty big. Okay, and then Arcane Missiles. So the way that Arcane Missiles fits into the kit right now is it's mainly used You only cast it with clear casting unless you take Arcane Harmony. There are situations where you may need to finish stacking to 20, but I recommend taking Mana Gem and just stacking a bit more mastery. I'll talk about talents in a sec or in a little bit, but you'll be casting missiles with clear casting procs, and using clear casting procs, what that does is causes your next 2 arcane blasts to hit for 20% or hit 20% harder, right? So this leads to what's called nether precision weaving, essentially. And you cast missiles with your clear casting proc. It gives you, here, I'll show you. Assuming it'll, there we go. Okay, so here, and then I have 2 stacks of nether precision. So that combo right there, missiles, blast, blast, that's nether precision weaving. And that's essentially what the filler is. And a lot of, that's like the Magi rotation. A lot of our current rotation comes down to using a clear casting proc in single target, using a clear casting proc to, those missiles hit harder, or they cast faster, and there's 3 additional bolts in clear casting missiles thanks to that talent. But then it procs the nether precision and you weave those back and forth. Okay, next spell is Nether Tempest. And the main thing to be aware of with Nether Tempest is that, and I find this interesting, so I cast it on here. If you'll notice, it's actually ticking like twice, right? So the dot on the mob is ticking, and then an additional AoE dot is splashing off, but also hitting that target. So the reason why that matters, the reason why that leads to more damage through the talent Arcane Echo is because Arcane Echo procs, I'm trying to open my talent. Arcane Echo procs off of every single instance of direct damage dealt, and there's no internal cooldown on that. So when you have a lot of haste and Nether Tempest is ticking really fast, each one of those ticks is actually like a double tick. So Nether Tempest does quite a bit of damage during it. So that's the main thing to be aware of. It is technically a DPS increase to maintain Nether Tempest at all times, but I find myself mostly casting Nether Tempest as filler when I start running out of mana, essentially. Okay, next spell, Arcane Surge. So Arcane Surge replaced Arcane Power and Dragonflight, and basically what it does is whatever mana you have, it converts that into damage, and then it gives you your Arcane Power buff and a mana regen buff. And then there's an interaction with the tier set, which changes the rotation. I'll get into it a little bit. But basically, Arcane Surge has become like a main focal point of our damage right now, which is a big reason why Mana Gem has actually pulled ahead of Arcane Harmony. Okay, Radiant Spark. So Radiant Spark is a holdover from Shadowlands, and essentially what it does is it buffs your next 5 spells starting with 0%. So the first spell gets 0% damage buff, then 10, 20, 30, 40%. So here, I'll show you. So if I were to do this and then cast Orb, the Orb didn't get any extra damage, but now I'm queued up for 10%, now 20, 30, 40% extra damage. And then the other part that is important to be aware of, which makes Radiant Spark very strong, and this is also the reason why we use Arcane Blast during the Radiant Spark ramp portion of the AoE ramp, is Harmonic Echo. So 20% of the damage dealt, so each direct damage thing that you deal, spell that you deal to a Radiant Spark target, Each of those stacks that's consumed will proc 20% of that damage to 4 additional nearby targets. So what's so cool about that is that sits us very firmly in a 5-target niche, because Barrage is a 5-target cleave as well. So it makes our 5-target cleave insane. Okay, and then Rune of Power. It's going away, thankfully, in 10.1.5. But in the meantime, it's important to be aware that you have, an 8-yard radius for 12 seconds for 40% damage buff. So it's just important to know the impact of being able to, like, that 4th Radiant Spark stack Arcane Blast during your ramp. 40% lost on that is quite a lot of damage. So important to be aware. It's not a huge area. Okay, so real quick, I am glad to see somebody felt like they needed it, because I needed it back in the day. This is how I start every class I ever play, pretty much. All right, so moving on from the base spell toolkit for Arcane, I'm going to talk about a couple of, like, general utility, miscellaneous types of things. First is Prismatic Barrier. This is one of my favorite, not my favorite, but is one of my favorite parts of, actually, my favorite part of the Arcane toolkit used to be Greater Invis, but now that's a general mage toolkit. So Prismatic Barrier might be my favorite part of the Arcane toolkit now. So the reason why I like it so much is, although it has a lower absorb amount, it reduces the amount of damage you take from an individual hit by 15%. So for example, my guild is progging Neltharion right now, and one of the hits in the later part of the first phase, I think, is like 800k or something. It's massive. So what I do in raid is I will purposefully wait to use Prismatic Barrier until those big individual hits are going off. Because even though it may not absorb much, just having the buff up reduces the amount of that overall hit by 15%. Which is pretty, it's saved me a lot. So Prismatic Barrier is something I think that's good to be aware of. And without having cheat death, without having cauterize, it can take the edge off big hit mechanics quite a bit. Okay, and then shifting power. It's pretty straightforward, but something to just be aware of in general is it's 12 seconds of cooldown reduction on all of your cooldowns, right? So that's defensives on every mage cooldown you have. So in situations, if you're going to be hitting shifting power soon, and say you want mirror images to be up soon as well, hitting mirror images, then hitting shifting power, little things like that can lead to getting big value. And then also the interaction between 30-second cooldown on Radiant Spark and 12 seconds of cooldown reduction from shifting power means that, like, in keys, sometimes I will send Radiant Spark by itself very shortly after my initial ramp, because it's up very quickly, but maybe the pack's not going to live long enough for me to get a full Magi ramp out. But I do have time to use Spark, get a little bit of that Harmonic Echo cleave, and maybe, since it's the end of a pack, if I can get an Execute Barrage, right, which I'll go into a little bit more in a sec. But basically, Radiant Spark by itself, I've always felt is a fairly strong, can be a fairly strong CD on its own. If you're in a situation where you can't really send the full ramp. But so long as it doesn't cause you to delay the ramp when you need to next time. That's the important caveat. All right, and then the next thing is Ice Flows versus Shimmer. So I think a lot more people have been picking up the Ice Flows playstyle. I'm a huge fan, especially since they fixed the bugs. But one thing that I think a lot of people probably aren't as aware of is that Blink removes, what does it say? Frees you from all stuns and bonds. So that includes roots, stuns. I can't think of what else is covered under that. Those are the only two that I can think of off the top of my head. But incredibly strong. Incredibly strong. Being able to blink out of stuns has been very, very helpful. Oh, and then of course, I do have a short video on my channel, but something to be aware of with ice flows is actually one thing in particular that I've started doing is when I want to use ice flows, say there's a mechanic coming up and I need to move towards the end of this cast, I will try really hard to wait to activate ice flows until right at the end, because then it will let me kind of, let's see if I can time it well. So I can move a little bit at the end of that cast and then I still have the ice flows charged for the next one. So this is kind of utilizing the way that ice flows double dipping works. And that's what I do have a short on my channel. But essentially if you have ice flows up and then you're casting and right at the end, if you hit ice flow again, notice this is the second spell and now the third spell, but I only use 2 charges of ice flows. So that's a way that you can get extra uses, and I find that to be very, very effective in raid, especially when you need to drop rune. So like, put this up, Radiant Spark, well, ice flows. I guess I didn't really do the extension double dip thing, but ice flows in general, I just find incredibly useful. Because then say a swirly spawns here, I can move out of the swirly and probably stay in my room. All right. Next, Greater Invis. Amazing, amazing, amazing button. It's Feign Death because it's instant cast, and it's a 60% damage reduction. It's a shield wall for 3 seconds after you leave stealth. Which is insane. So when you hit it, you essentially have 4 seconds of 60% damage reduction, which is not super long. So it is important to know when you want to hit it. You know, you want to try to hit it for like right before the first tick of something goes off, so it will like last to the third tick or something. Like you just want to make sure you get full value out of it, because it is easy to send it and accidentally send it a little too early and then still get shrugged. And then mirror images. This is the last like general miscellaneous thing I want to go over. So mirror images are incredibly effective in keys at keeping you alive. Not because of the damage reduction, but because as you're running into a pull, if you use mirror images before you get started, so long as your mirror images are alive, you will not pull threat. Right, like that combo, not the rotation, don't pay attention to that, but the way that I walked in there, that is what it looks like in keys for me. I will precast mirror images pretty much every lust pull. If images is up, I will precast it. And then between mirror images and invis, you should have more than enough threat drop to not pull threat and die, hopefully. But images, precasting images with how long they last is very helpful. Yeah, I know, right? The ice flows thing was like, I remember when they fixed it, all of a sudden I went like a week without noticing anything and then realized like, oh, wait a second. Like now it just feels amazing. All right. Got a couple more arcane topics to go over, and then we'll get into 10.1 stuff. So, arcane talents. The important talents to be aware of is like Mana Gem. So that is our current like DPS spec right now. It's I don't know why it doesn't show the cooldown. It's a 1.5 minute cooldown that cools down with shifting power. So what Mana Gem does is it restores 25% mana, but more importantly, it gives you a 5% damage buff for 12 seconds, which you overlap or you use right after Arcane Surge, so you can overlap that with the Rune of Power that the Surge buff gives you. So you're getting, 5% on top of that, and it gives you and then Arcane Harmony. Like I said before, Mana Gem's the go-to playstyle right now. This is my single target setup. But if you do want to play Arcane Harmony, because I think depending on your gear, it can sim higher. I personally have been loving the Mana Gem playstyle in general over Arcane Harmony because it's just less micromanaging. But every Arcane Missile you cast gives you a stack of Arcane Harmony, which buffs your next barrage by 5% up to 20 stacks. So it's mainly like the initial big barrage that gets your damage buff in the ramps. But because of the tier set, which I'll go into a little bit more in a sec, Arcane Surge, it basically the tier set has changed things to where we're barrage magiing a little bit early in the ramp. So Mana Gem with a bit more mastery, stacking a bit more mastery, has pulled ahead quite a bit. Okay, and then okay, so Impetus, this is a single target talent setup versus AoE talent setup, right? There's only 4 talents that I really swap between ever. So this is my single target setup, and what defines the single target setup is Impetus, which Arcane Blast has a 10% chance to generate an additional arcane charge, but if you're already at 4, which you generally are, there's a lot of Arcane Blast filler right now, you actually get a 10% damage buff for 10 seconds. So incredibly strong talent. And then this is just 1 point into extra arcane missile damage. You're only ever going to take extra arcane missile damage if you are on a purely single target fight like Rashok, right? Patchwork exclusively. If there's any cleave at all ever, you want to swap out of arcane missiles into arcane cleave. So you still, because a lot of our rotation, especially in raid, but in just single target in general, our rotation has so many arcane blasts that taking Impetus in, like, this is a cleave raid setup that I would run with. And I can't think of a boss where I think I ran this talent on Primalist Council last year, Primalist Council last year, because there was consistently 4 targets, but this is generally what the raid setup is going to look like with Arcane Cleave, so you can take advantage of Funnel if there are cleave targets, and then Impetus so your Arcane Blasts have a chance to proc that damage buff. All right, what's next? Okay, so Arcane Bombardment. This is where Arcane gets its execute from. So Arcane Barrage deals double damage on targets below 35% health. I like to look at this as simply 20 stacks of Arcane Harmony, right? So when I'm making decisions about whether or not I cast Barrage or Arcane Blast during execute, I will try to include a Barrage like as with the last global of Magi, and then try to like send a Barrage out with the very last bit of the Arcane Surge buff, because Barrage snapshots, which I'll cover in a sec. But I try, I like to just think of it as, okay, if there's execute, then that target has 20 Arcane Harmony stacks on that Barrage. And so I make my decisions accordingly the same way that I have in the past about having like 20 stacks on your Barrage, because it hits incredibly hard. And then during execute on cleave, it just gets nutty. Like Neltharion phase 3 is a beautiful example of how things can just get wild with the 4 extra targets for funnel and execute on the boss. So much damage. All right, next is Siphon Storm. Okay, so Siphon Storm is what turns evocation from just give me my mana back to it's now a DPS cooldown that you sync up every single time you use Surge or Surge. So your DPS ramp, your Arcane Surge ramp, is always going to start with using Evocation to lead into the ramp because it gives you a huge damage ramp. You want to make sure you fully channel it. It's very easy to accidentally think, okay, we're pulling, it's almost done. Oh, I got lucky there. But there have been many times where I have started casting at that same point and I cut it off and I only got 6 stacks. So it's important to make sure that you're waiting just long enough to get that full 7 stacks before you go into the ramp. All right, and then next talent, last talent I'm gonna go over is Slipstream. And this is what allows you to move while channeling Evocation or clear casting arcane missiles. The reason why it's important to be aware of this is because arcane CDs, the ramp is very unforgiving. So a huge part of us being able to do damage is knowing where we're going to stand ahead of time, planning where you want to drop your rune, making sure that you don't have to cancel a cast because, you know, this is not a high haste build. So canceling casts is hugely punishing, especially during a ramp. So taking advantage of every opportunity you have with Slipstream to reposition even slightly helps a lot over the long run. All right, and then last section before 10.1 stuff. Some basic concepts. So double lust management. So this temporal warp, what it does is it gives us the ability while we have the sated debuff to cast time warp again and get an additional buff called temporal warp. I think it's called temporal. Yeah. Called temporal warp on top of time warp. So we get 30% haste buffs. So the double lust is just absolutely insane. What this does though, especially this is mainly in keys, but it puts you in a position to where you get a personal lust to where you get to use time warp once in between your group lusts. You have you have about a minute window in order to do that because shifting power has cooldown reduction on the actual time warp spell, which has a 5-minute cooldown. So it's gonna come up around 4.5 minutes generally. And then I have found you wanna try to cast it by 4.5 minutes left on sated, because you don't want to force your group to have to wait on lust. Like you don't want your time warp cooldown to not be up when sated drops. So there are times where I will, even though it feels horrible, I'll just send it on a mini burn, right? I'll just send it not with Arcane Surge, just personal lust with a mini burn, because a cooldown used is always going to be more damage than unused, right? So, or like lost. So it's important to be aware of your sated debuff, and it's important to make sure that you do take advantage of that, because haste accelerates our damage a pretty hilarious amount. All right, and then barrage snapshotting. So the way that barrage calculates its damage is when you cast it, it will figure out like, okay, how many targets am I cleaving onto? What damage buffs do I have? How much damage am I actually dealing? That's calculated not when it hits the target, but it snapshots it the second you cast it, right? So what that means is if you have a buff that's just about falling off, you can cast barrage right before that buff goes off, and it'll land and still do the extra 40% damage. There's no reference, so we don't know for sure that I got that, but I have looked at it in the past. And that's how that snapshotting is how we back in the day used to snapshot and double dip this situation on the 4th spark stack, right? Because barrage will snapshot. Now there is a situation now that you need to be aware of the snapshotting with the AoE rotation, which when I go over the AoE rotation, I will point that out. But essentially the important takeaway on barrage snapshotting is it calculates the damage. It like spell cues it a little bit. So if I were, actually, I'll just go over it now. So if I were to spam barrage right now, that barrage, even though it landed and consumed the 4th spark stack, it actually got the 3rd spark stack buff. So it missed 10% additional damage because I spell cued the barrage and it snapshotted that spell cued damage. So when I spell queued it up, it looked and saw, okay, there's a 3rd spark, or that 3rd spark stack, 30% damage buff, and that's what it calculates off of. So you gotta wait until the end of it. That it really only applies to the AoE rotation, which, like I said, I'll go into more detail. But okay, I already went over barrage, cleave, funnel. I find it really important. Is it a golden rule to never use missiles before Radiant Spark is done? I mean, missiles will consume your Radiant Spark stacks, so you never want to use missiles on Radiant Spark. Like, if you look here, so it's only buffing each missile bolt, which when that does happen, it's tragic. Yeah. You want to try, even if you're at three clear casting stacks, you want to keep casting Arcane Blast into, or whatever the ramp. The Spark ramp is more of a rigid, like, it's a rotation, right? It's more of a specific rotation. And then the Magi ramp after, which there's not much of it after anymore because of the rotation, but the Spark ramp is generally, just Arcane Blasts. And then the Barrage Magi combo point. Okay. Okay, so in general, I have found with Arcane that it is really important to use your cooldowns on cooldown as much as possible. I find that easier to do in raid because things kind of, you use them like as they come up, but in keys, it's pretty easy to get into a trap of holding cooldowns. At least I find it to be easy sometimes. So it's really important. I like to just try to run in with the tank, and whatever cooldowns I have up on that pull, that's what I send. And usually the cadence is you have surge one pull, then the next pull you have a mini ramp, then you have a surge ramp the next pull, and it kind of alternates. But depending on like tyrannical weeks or the key level and stuff like that, things get complicated. So the rule that I like to try to follow is whatever cooldowns you have, try to send them on pull. And so long as you can get full value out of them, you can send them, right? But the earlier you start your ramp on pull, the better chance you're going to have of the tank not kiting and keeping mobs grouped up, right? And well, I mean, really, that's all of it. It's you're going to have higher health targets to pump more damage into. Things are going to be grouped up. Like there's a lot of benefit to trying to start your ramp as soon as you get into combat, which also means really important to try and have your 4 arcane charges pooled and ready to go by the end of the last pack. If you're playing Arcane Harmony, that means 4 arcane charges and 20 Arcane Harmony stacks. Yes, Radiant Spark. You can think of Radiant Spark as being kind of paired to Touch of the Magi. Like Touch of the Magi, Radiant Spark, and Arcane Surge and Evocate, they're all kind of in the same vein. I will use Spark by itself in niche situations in keys like towards the second half of a long pull. If Magi is not going to come up to actually get value on that pull, sometimes I'll send Spark by itself because of the execute harmonic echo cleave. It can be pretty big. But outside of that, Radiant Spark should be used as a part of the ramp with Touch of the Magi. That's like 95%, 99% of the time. That's how it's going to be used. All right, and then the last concept before I get into 10.1 stuff is missile clipping, which basically just, it has a little bit of a different context for the tier and our rotation right now, but missile clipping in general refers to, if you look at on here, you can see these bars, vertical bars. I think my cursor might be in the way, but you won't be able to see them with this or the clear casting ones. But basically, it shows you where each tick of the missile bolt is. And what missile clipping is essentially, if I clip that cast a little bit early, the full amount of bolts will still go out. It'll just kind of double, it'll like tag the last bolt onto the beginning of the next channel. So it's not actually a loss. So that's what missile clipping has been historically for Arcane. And we just clip the missiles a lot earlier now because of the tier bonus, which I guess I'll just. Okay, cool. We are getting on to the 10.1 portion of this. I'm gonna be right back real quick, and then we'll get started. All right. Cool. All right, so 10.1. First thing to go over is the tier set. So the two-piece, it extended the duration of Arcane Surge by 3 seconds, but more importantly, it increased the amount of damage that you get from Arcane Surge. And I think that this is the big reason why Mana Gem has pulled ahead of Arcane Harmony, because that overlap of it's a 45% damage buff now. That's huge. Plus 5% for Mana Gem means every Arcane Surge is 50% damage plus the 40%. Yeah, it's a lot. And then the 4-piece on top of that. So for every 24,000 mana spent on and during Arcane Surge. I didn't actually realize that it was on and during. I thought it was just during Arcane Surge. So the mana you sink into Arcane Surge as well contributes to that buff. Okay, so it gives you a 1% damage buff for 18 seconds up to 25 stacks and more mana regen. So you can keep spamming. So essentially, what that looks like is, so I have the 45% damage buff here. Spending mana, this is not a rotation, by the way. I'm just trying to get to the end of this to show you the buff. Spending mana, and then it changes over into this. So spell damage increased, mana regen increased. So it essentially takes your 18 seconds of damage and tacks on another, 18 seconds on the back end of it. And then I find that overlaps a little bit with the next Magi ramp, which I have videos of the slow motion videos of the rotation I'll get into in just a sec. Okay, so that is the 2-piece and 4-piece bonus. And then when it comes to trinkets, I got very lucky. Just get this in your weekly chest like I did. But you definitely want an Iridius Fragment. It's unreal how much this accelerates your damage. I mean, Talon is good too, but I really like the mastery on this. Especially, yeah, it fits really well. This has been going well for me so far, but Vessel of Skittering Shadow, I think, is because it gives you like a ramping haste buff. That one makes more sense to me. There are a couple other passive trinkets. I think the Neltharion one is pretty good as well, but the main trinket you want to focus on is Iridius Fragment. Sure. No, this is 10.1 live, not PTR. 10.1 went live a little bit ago. And then, okay, and then stats. When it comes to stats, always sim. But I wanted to show that crit and mastery, I have showing how much. Why didn't that work? Okay, so with these stats, 27 crit, 14 haste, 9 verse, and 39 mastery. These are my stat weights. So my haste is a little bit low, clearly, but mastery is just weighted insanely high. Again, because of mana gem and the fact that we just get to spam Arcane Blast with all the damage buff we get. Having more mastery is really, really good. But crit, mastery are, the top stats you want to target. And then I still view haste as kind of more of a quality of life thing. You're struggling to get through the rotation and you want it to speed up a little bit, and obviously based on these stats, haste is not a terrible stat. I only have 15%. There's 15. Yeah, 14.26. So, but yeah, crit mastery primary ones, and I would say probably 24%, 25% crit or higher. And then ideally, like 32% plus mastery, 35. All right, awesome. Time to get into the rotation. So, starting with the single target rotation. I didn't put a pull timer up, but you're going to be casting Evocation around 7.5 seconds left on the pull timer. I have this playing in slow motion. Speed it up. So this is real time. So you're pre-casting Arcane Blast, followed by Orb, then Lust, Pot, then Spark, Nether Tempest, followed by Arcane Surge, and then at this point, you hit Trinkets, Mana Gem, Racial, and then go into Magi. So this is the Barrage Magi combo, right? And what that is because if you remember, Barrage uses all of our arcane charges when we cast it, right? So that would put us at 0 arcane charges. But then Magi gives us 4 arcane charges. So what we do is we have Radiant Spark up, we have everything kind of everything's set, and then we cast Barrage, empties our charges, as you can see down here. And then before that barrage hits, I casted Magi. So Magi's on the target, and then the barrage lands. The barrage contributes to Magi, and we don't lose a DPS global, right? So that was one of the really cool things with Magi being off the global that we gained access to in Dragonflight. So then after I cast the Barrage Magi combo, I then continue to cast Arcane Blast. And you can see here, this is actually that situation where I have 3 clear casting stacks and Radiant Spark's not done. You just keep, I think I actually just procced another one, and no, I didn't. But then after this, then you go into missiles. And then at this point, the new type of missile clipping that we want to do based on the tier set is as soon as the global comes up, you want to start casting blast. And we're doing the nether precision weaving to where it's missiles, blast, blast, missiles, blast, blast, right? I clip it, but I'm clipping it a little bit late. But you do want to, this is basically the entirety of the surge ramp. After you get through that initial radiant spark, magi, it's just weaving. And then towards the end of the surge buff, you can see I have 2.3 seconds. So I use this missiles, and then I hit presence of mind just before that missiles was up, because the goal here is I want to get 2 more arcane blasts in before that arcane surge buff drops off. So I cast 1, 2, and I got the second one you can see down here casted just before that buff dropped off. Right, so that's my goal every time on single target in the opener is that rotation. And then at this point, there's 2 different ways of using Rune of Power. I like to during Lust because A, you have Lust, and B, I have the potion embellishment, so my potions last 45 seconds. As you can see, I still have pot quite a while. So what I like to do is as soon as surge drops off, I use shifting power. And I don't use shifting power after casting rune because it feels like an absolute waste of rune to like be sitting in rune with shifting casting. And I don't, yeah, I'll get into it a little bit later. Anyway, so I like to cast shifting power. And then as soon as I'm done with that, I'll drop rune. And what you'll see here is that I still have the tier damage buff, which is 25%, and pot and lust, right? So I like to use rune during the tier bonus, during this circumstance, during pot and lust. And then towards the end of this, you'll see, okay, so here's the conditions. We've got 6 seconds left. I actually went for it when I think 7 seconds left on Magi. So about 7 seconds left on Magi, 9 seconds left on the tier bonus, plenty of time left on pot. So, and 6 seconds left on rune. So what I do here is I'm going to do what is the old Magi ramp, which is using Spark initially, then casting Blast up to the 4th Spark stack, and then casting Barrage into Magi, because our tier bonus doesn't do anything for the surge or for the mini ramp. It only affects the surge ramp. So what I do here is I see that if I start my Spark ramp right now, then by the time I want to cast Barrage and Magi, Magi should be up, right? So I cast Radiant Spark, Arcane Blast 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then I cast Nether Tempest. And then Magi, I probably point with my mouse. Magi is coming up. I'm a little early, so I had to wait the, half a global. Ideally, I should have held my rune another global, because if you look, I lose the rune buff right before I cast. Right before I cast Barrage, I lose the rune buff. But if I had waited just a little bit, then I could have had the 4th Spark stack and the tier bonus and rune and pot for that Barrage, because if you remember, Barrage snapshots. So even if I'm 40 yards away and I wait to cast that Magi until the Barrage gets right next to the target, it will still benefit from all of these damage buffs. And then that overlap right there, trying to get Magi cast right as your tier buff is dropping off, that seems to be about where the cadence is for the single target rotation and rotating your cooldown. Then at this point, it's Nether precision weaving. And then I clipped that one a little early because I was trying to take advantage of my pot. See how my pot was starting to drop off? I keep pointing with my finger. on my mouse. Boom. So it hit just before the pot drops off. And then the filler in between ramps is pretty much this. I have a lot of mastery, so I don't generally run out of mana. But when you get to this point where you're running out of mana and you're coming up on a ramp, that's when it's time to start keeping Nether Tempest up. You want to cast Ice Nova or Fire Blast. Nether Tempest makes a good filler because it's, like I said earlier, it is a DPS increase technically to keep it up at all times. But yeah, and then so this is an example of what I do with my Surge ramp outside of Lust. So I don't use Rune directly after Surge during the tier bonus outside of Lust. It makes more sense to me. Here, I'll just show you. So we get through here. And then, well, it overlaps, right? But I'm not dropping it immediately after. I like to do the same shifting power. And then I casted missiles because I wanted to wait a little bit for the cast Rune. So Spark, Rune, and now I'm doing the Spark ramp because I have the tier bonus, Rune, and then it's going to go into the fourth overlap there. Yeah. So does that make sense? It's a lot of information, and a lot of it I've been kind of actively figuring out over the last couple weeks. But that is the single target rotation. Does anybody have any questions about the single target rotation before I move on to AoE? Okay, cool. Move on to AoE. All right, so AoE rotation. This is if I had prepped properly with my 4 arcane charges at the previous poll. This is what running in would look like, right? Assuming. Okay, so Radiant Spark, Arcane Surge, and for AoE, you want to cast Nether Tempest after Arcane Surge, and the reason for that is because Nether Tempest has I believe it's a 12-second duration, so it's the same duration as Magi, and because of what I said earlier about how it double ticks Arcane Echo is an AoE proc, and so Nether Tempest gains huge value in AoE because of how frequently it causes Arcane Echo to tick. So you want to cast Nether Tempest after Surge so you get more of the buff up during Magi. So Arcane Surge, I hit Mana Gem and Nether Tempest, and then Barrage Magi combo, right? And then Arcane Blast, and the reason for Arcane Blast in this situation, again, like I said earlier, is because of Harmonic Echo. Each one of these direct Arcane Blasts are proccing for AoE damage off of my Radiant Spark target. Right? And then I get to the 4th Spark stack, and this was the situation that I was talking about earlier. To reiterate, you just want to make sure that in this circumstance, while this blast is casting, you're not pressing Barrage. Because if you press Barrage right here, it will only give you the 30% buff, not the 40% buff. So then I cast Barrage, And then since this is AoE, I do orb, barrage, orb, and then missiles. And then I like to send a barrage into Magi right at the end. I try to send as many 4-charge barrages into Magi as I can. So what I'll do is until my last arcane orb. So that ramp is the same every time. But once I've used my last arcane orb and I have my last set of like 4 charges without having to cast Arcane Explosion 4 times to build them back up. With Magi up, I'll do Arcane Blasts, Arcane Missiles. You know, usually you'll have clear casting procs to work with, which are really good for burst AoE, thanks to Arcane Echo. But then right as Magi ends, again, because Magi pops for AoE damage as well, it makes sense to me to send that barrage into Magi, which leaves you with a little bit of an awkward tail of Arcane Surge, as you can see. But Arcane Explosion hits pretty hard anyways, so that rotation's been working for me so far. And then this is the filler. So the main difference between Arcane Harmony and the Mana Gem playstyle is, as you saw there, I used my clear casting proc on Arcane Explosion. So you want to do that on 3+ targets for Mana Gem. All right, so at this point, I don't know why I Arcane Blasted. I think I was just trying to fill. I was trying to fill that. That's what I was doing. I was trying to fill and hold my charges but I should have Arcane Explosion. Yeah, so I cast Radiant Spark, and this is the mini ramp now. Radiant Spark into Nether Tempest, followed by Rune. And if I had done it a little bit earlier, I could have used that tier buff, but in keys, generally pulls will not, you're not going to get a full round of like Surge, then mini ramp CDs chained back to back. It generally doesn't happen unless you're pushing really high keys, or higher keys on a fort week. So it's not really something to shoot for. This is more of the rotation in a vacuum. But yeah, so after the Nether Tempest, I drop Rune, and then immediately Barrage Magi, and then Arcane Blast, again because of Harmonic Echo, to ramp up to the 4th Spark stack. And then Barrage. I have 2 Arcane Orbs. So I have Orb, Barrage, Orb. And then I think I cast Missiles here and just clip it. And then barely make it in at the end, right? And this, by the way, playing in melee is very helpful. Can be very, very helpful. Barrage travel time does matter with Magi because it needs to actually hit the target before Magi goes off. It will snapshot damage buffs, but because Magi is a debuff on your target, it has to actually fully travel to the center of the target's hitbox before it will register, or wherever the actual damage register part of the hitbox is. Cool. And then the last thing I want to demonstrate is this is just what it looks like if you don't have charges running up to a pole. So it's just Spark, Orb, and then you do the normal Nether Tempest, Barrage Magi, Arcane Blast, Barrage. Right? And then you just have one less to use, or one less barrage to cast during the ramp. Thankfully, because I had 3 clear casting missiles, still a whole bunch of damage. Cool. Let me look over my notes real quick, but I think that might be all of it. And I just realized I've been talking for an hour. So yeah, that might have been all of it. Let's see. Yeah. Cool. So open it up to general questions, follow up, anything really. All right. There are no follow-up questions. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you, everyone, for hanging out. I hope something helped. I'm going to be chopping all this up into a video at some point over the next week, or maybe a couple videos with how long this ended up being. But yeah, it was a good time. I enjoyed that. Have a good one. I will catch you next Saturday for office hours. Peace.